The Seahawks stunned the football world when they decided to move on from Pete Carroll, opening up the head coaching spot for the first time since 2009. And the Seahawks have plenty of other issues they're going to be dealing with as they try to get a replacement for their head coach. We're going to be breaking it all down with Brad Spielberger of Pro Football Focus coming up next here on Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, the host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. A special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether you're listening in nearby Bellevue or you're over in Scotland. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We've got a doubleheader today for Blue Friday to kick off the offseason. Really excited to bring in Brad Spielberger from Pro Football Focus, also a contributor to overthecap.com, which we use religiously on this podcast. And there will be plenty of cap lingo that we'll be throwing out here on this show. Thanks, Brad, for jumping on. Greatly appreciate it. And we're excited to have you coming on as a regular now here on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm glad my first appearance didn't, preclude a second one.
That's usually what I say to people if I'm on a show. If I come on a second time, my bald head did not blind you or scare you. Anyway, this has been a historic week in the NFL and in college football. The coaching movement, we just saw Kalen DeBoer take the job at Alabama. Washington fans obviously are upset about that, but that was the second high-profile coaching exit this week. That one was by choice. The other one, Pete Carroll, no longer the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks, and that was a decision that was made, according to Carroll, by the front office owner, Jody Allen. What was your initial reaction when you saw the news that Pete Carroll, after 14 seasons, no longer was the head coach for the Seahawks and the decision was not made by him?
Yeah, I think it's easy to forget that he's in his 70s because he has the energy of a 22-year-old. So, that's your first initial take back. But, I think it's interesting. So, look, clearly he still is a great emotional leader, a guy that gets his players to believe in themselves, of course, referring to the quarterbacks there, but many other players as well. There's so much good there. I think the only thing I would say is, he is the coach on the defensive side of the football, and that unit, really has not been good enough the last couple of years. So it's kind of interesting because I feel like him and Belichick are opposites, where I think Belichick was falling short from a personnel standpoint. I don't know if he's falling short from a leadership standpoint, but there were way more kind of ruffling of feathers and kind of bad reports about, people being upset. However, his defense, was still really, really good. So they kind of had the opposite boxes checked there, but certainly surprising. It's never not going to be surprising when Pete Carroll, kind of like you said, kind of gets gently pushed upstairs into a different role. But, at the end of the day, it's not totally shocking just because his unit, kind of came up short this year.
Yeah, and that's been the argument that I've been making really for like 3 or 4 weeks. This is not something I was surprised about just because it felt like, and I don't have any sourcing on this in particular, but this felt like a situation, Brad, where the ownership group, I don't think that they completely entered this meeting this week just wanting to push him out. I think that there was probably an olive branch thrown to him like, you need to go out and get a defensive coordinator that's a proven commodity that runs different stuff and has fresh ideas. And I just don't know that Pete Carroll was willing to do that. And again, that's just speculation, but that is educated speculation based on some of the things I've seen. But as you and I both would agree, it's obviously a bittersweet situation with what he's accomplished, but you can understand why the Seahawks made this move. Keeping that in mind, looking at this Seahawks team, you mentioned the personnel grouping, maybe a little different than Bill Belichick, where it feels like it's pretty bare there in New England with the talent they've got. Can't say the same for the Seahawks. When you look at the now 7 openings that there are, since the Patriots are no longer available, where do you see the Seahawks stacking up in terms of being an ideal landing spot for a prospective head coach?
I think it should be right at the top of many, many lists. I mean, you have, of course, start with the quarterback, always a big piece. Look, is Geno going to be a 10-year starter? No, but is he a very, very high upside? I shouldn't even call him a bridge. It's a good starter that you then, though, in a year or a couple of years, could maybe draft somebody, develop them beneath Geno Smith. So you have that. You have talent all across the board, in particular, a lot of rookie contract talent. Of course, the 2 first-rounders this year. Boye Mafe had a second-year breakout, in my opinion, this year, coming off the edge. There are so many pieces there to work with. Again, some veterans and some guys we'll get into. Do they need to move on? Things of that nature. But, I just don't see why you wouldn't say, all right, it's a stable org. I know they're looking to sell. Maybe you could say, okay, if they're looking to sell, they want to keep the value high. They want to, kind of like Denver just did. There's a lot of reasons why this should be one of the most, if not the most attractive options. John Schneider is a proven good GM, a guy that will work with you. He obviously worked with Pete Carroll. Maybe some people would say 4 at times, Pete Carroll. I think there's a lot of reasons to like this opening.
Yeah, they really have a lot of things going for them, as we'll talk about later in this show, though I'm sure there is one thing that really jumps out that might spook some potential candidates from this coaching job, but they have all that established talent. They have clear youth. I mean, I think this is as good of a young core as you're going to find in the NFL that they've put together the last couple of years, and that's a credit to Carroll and John Schneider for getting those players. But as far as replacements go, you have a chance to see the entire league. You've got the whole league perspective. Who are some candidates that jump to mind? And I know Dan Quinn's been the first name thrown out there, and I expected that. And Dan Quinn is going to be one of the front runners, if he isn't the front runner, to take this position. But who are some of the wild cards out there, or at least some candidates that you could see making a lot of sense to fill Pete Carroll's Nike Air Monarchs on the sideline?
Yeah, it's super interesting because, like you said, I get why Dan Quinn's name jumps to the top of the list, and he has always known one of the biggest attractive parts about him is he'll get a good staff. He's a guy people like to work with. Of course, now in today's NFL, a lot of people think you should go offensive coach, offensive hire, because you might lose coordinators and all those things. But he is known as a guy who can build out a great staff, and that's always a positive. It's funny because if you are going to go offense, like Dave Canales was in your building a couple of years ago, obviously they're letting Shane Waldron go interview other places, which would, in theory, suggest he's maybe not a strong candidate for the head coaching job. And I personally, I love Ben Johnson. I would hire him in a millisecond. I don't know if this is the opening for him. I like Bobby Slowick, but I think he might be a year away and needs a little bit more seasoning as a play caller. Canales obviously been 1 year as a play caller too. It's interesting. Maybe you go after a guy like a Mike McDonald, who was phenomenal in Baltimore this year. That's obviously defensive side of the football, but talk about a guy that has revolutionized defense and is doing different things than everybody else. Top 10 in, sim pressure rate, stunt rate, rotating coverage rate, everything he's doing. And that's not revolutionary, but it's just so dynamic and catered to the skill set of his players and this amoeba approach to how he does defense. So I don't know. I guess let's go with him. I like Mike McDonald going to Seattle.
Yeah, get a defensive coach, a second defensive coach. It's oddly enough, as you've said, that is where they really need the jolt right now, even though Pete Carroll was their coach 2 years in a row, 24th and 25th in scoring defense. I want to throw one more name out there and just get your thoughts on this, because we know Jim Harbaugh and Pete Carroll's relationship and the fact that those two coached against each other in the NFC West, arguably the most intense rivalry we've seen in the last 25 years. The irony of hiring him, but at the same time, I just want to get your thoughts. If Seattle should get the checkbook out and see if they could make that happen.
Why not? I get that Harbaugh is interesting you just had it with Pete though. So he's going to want final say the 53 as well. And maybe that's a sticking point and maybe they try to pivot away from that, but nevertheless, that's going to be part of it. But yeah, Harbaugh is clearly still one of the best coaches in all of football. I know he wants to come back to the NFL for sure. No question about it. I did mention too, this isn't a show about ownership transfer and stuff like that, but these owners do think of that in the back of their mind. If we're going to have these transfers, if you have a good coach under contract, you have a quarterback, all these things, you can add an extra $1 billion to your, valuation and probably, back it up and get good value. So there's no reason not to at least give him the phone call, hear him out. He obviously has connections to the West Coast. If it's not the Pacific Northwest, still, the Bay Area is not that far away. Yeah, why not?
And he developed an NFL quarterback at the University of San Diego. That's also worth noting. The guy seems to be able to coach wherever he goes. And if you could bring in a big name like that, that's what Paul Allen did back in the day with Pete Carroll. And that worked out pretty well for the Seahawks. So I think all these names we've thrown out all make a lot of sense. When we come back for the second segment here, we're going to shift to the salary cap. And Brad, he's the expert, not me. We're going to let him be the bean counter here on today's show. And we're going to look at what the Seahawks can do to try to fix what looks like a pretty shaky salary cap situation right now heading into the offseason. Don't go away. You're listening to the Locked On Seahawks podcast. This episode is brought your way by Game Time. If you've ever been on the hunt for sports or concert tickets at the last minute, the process can be anxiety-provoking. Buying tickets to your favorite events shouldn't be stressful. Your hair shouldn't fall out so you look like me. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, and comedy near you, and they've got killer deals on last-minute tickets. And with their best price guarantee, you can stop stressing out and start getting hyped for the fun you're going to have. If you want to see the Kraken game in downtown Seattle, they've won 8 in a row. You need to go out there and see these guys. They're playing great hockey right now. Using Game Time's awesome flash deals feature and a detailed stadium app, you can find awesome seats for under $120 right now. And it's super easy. Forget planning months in advance. You can get your tickets on Game Time right up to the day of the event. And with the Game Time guarantee, you'll always get the best price. So if you find tickets in the same section in row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Snag the tickets without the stress with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code Locked On for $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account, redeem the code Locked On for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. You're listening to a bonus Blue Friday edition here on the Locked On Seahawks podcast. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined by PFF's salary cap guru, Brad Spielberger. Also does some great work contributing with overthecap.com as well. We just talked about Pete Carroll. This is still a move in Seattle that is creating seismic waves with him no longer being the coach, and obviously Washington losing their head coach as well. But whoever takes this job, whether it's Jim Harbaugh or Mike McDonald, or they bring back Dave Canales or Dan Quinn, whoever gets this job is going to enter a somewhat difficult situation from a salary cap perspective, Brad. This is a team that, according to Over the Cap, who you contribute for, right now, negative $9 million in effective cap space. That's one of the worst in the NFL. Obviously, there's ways they could fix this, but could that be something that maybe deters some of these candidates who are looking at the Seahawks right now?
So because the way you can go about fixing it would not require anything crazy, I would say no. Of course, it's not the same situation as, going to, we mentioned like a Washington, somewhere where it's a blank slate, you're getting a new quarterback on a rookie deal. Like, yeah, there's other elements to it. But at a high level, you have a quarterback on a team-friendly deal, and you have a bunch of recent draft picks that are on these good surplus value contracts in theory. And then just very quickly, here's what I did. I did a post-June 1st release of Jamal Adams, which I think is an expectation at this point, that clears $16.5 million. So with one move already, we've wiped out that negative, almost doubled where we're looking at in terms of a salary cap standpoint, and then a couple of restructures. You restructure a Tyler Lockett, a Draymond Jones, a Geno Smith. You're adding another $20 million right there. More than that, about $23 million. So, all these different mechanisms, they're good players that you want to keep around anyway. Seattle is not afraid of having heavy proration on their contracts and kind of go about business this way already. The interesting decisions, I think, come down to, well, not super interesting. I think Brian Monet didn't play this year, probably on the way out. You save $6 million there. And then, Seahawks legend, been there for a couple of years now, been really, really good. We mentioned Jamal Adams. Is Quandre Diggs also maybe on the way out? Could clear $11 million with a cut there. The last thing I'll say, if you don't want to cut these guys, approach a Quandre Diggs, approach a Will Dissly, maybe for a pay cut of sorts. But anyway, long answer short, I think there are non-difficult decisions you can make. And with everything I just listed out, we're at $52 million in cap space. And I really haven't said anything crazy, right? So I don't think it's going to be a deterrent. I think there's still plenty to work with without, becoming New Orleans Saints and restructuring, every single contract on the roster.
Yeah, that's the thing I think fans have to understand. John Schneider in the past has been pretty against the idea of kicking money down the road. But just this last season, they did it with Lockett and they did it with Jamal Adams, which doing that with Jamal Adams, that screamed to me that they plan to have him around. And then Pete Carroll made some comments towards the end of the season when they put him in injured reserve that they thought he just needed a full healthy offseason. But I'm with you. This, especially with Pete Carroll now not being the coach, this feels like something that is just, it's imminent that he is going to be moved on from at some point this offseason. I would think that post June 1st designation so that you can maximize the cap space that you're going to be opening up. Nobody's going to be trading for him. I think Tyler Lockett is maybe the most interesting name on there, though, because you are talking about a guy that is now into his 30s, and he's coming off a down season by his standards. He didn't get to 1,000 receiving yards. Jackson Smith and Jigba's presence impacted that, but could he be maybe that wild card to watch here where the Seahawks, instead of restructuring, maybe they look into some other things they could potentially do with him, especially now that Smith and Jigba is on the team with DK Metcalf?
Yeah, I mean, look, both guys you just mentioned, obviously not clean one-to-ones, but you drafted Devon Witherspoon. You have a guy that can play in the box in the slot and do some Jamal Adams-y type things, come, on nickel blitzes, stuff like that. And then, Jackson Smith and Jigba, I know he was a pure slot this year, and maybe he belongs there for the most part, but I think he can play as a Z and do a lot of different things as well. So, yeah, I would say Lockett. Maybe you're looking at a Brandon Cooks type trade compensation, which is not super overwhelming. It's a 5th and a 6th round pick, but he probably still carries a ton of value. He still is a good player. But like you said, maybe a bit of a wild card there if they do think it's a transition period. I think maybe they find a way to make it work. Maybe they do, negotiate a pay cut or something of that nature, just because I'm sure they love the guy. But yeah, you can get creative. I think the key point is just that, I don't think any coach or GM or coach is looking at this and saying, I'm worried about this opening because of the salary cap situation. I just don't really see it that way.
Yeah, it's not the New Orleans Saints, and they find ways every year, it feels like, to be able to remedy their situation. So as bad as it looks on paper, it's not something that should be difficult for John Schneider to clean up, especially with all those rookie deals that they've got with key guys. Let's shift to the free agents now. And you mentioned Seattle could find a way to open $40, $50 million in cap space real quick. And they could probably find a way to afford both these guys. But let's assume that we're in a world where John Schneider doesn't restructure everybody he can restructure, and they are left with only one or the other. To me, this is my opinion. I think the two best free agents Seattle's got are both on defense. Leonard Williams, who they got from the New York Giants, who was fantastic. He was not the reason they missed the playoffs. He was really good after they traded for him. And Jordan Brooks, a player that I think coming off an ACL had a really good season, and he's only got 4 years under his belt. If you had to try to pick between those two guys and you could only sign one of them, who do you think is most important to bring back next year and for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I like both players. It's interesting. You don't want to buy into the sunk cost, of giving up a 2nd round pick and a 5th round pick just to go get a player and say, therefore, you have to retain that guy. You probably should. You don't have the franchise tag at your disposal for him. He's been tagged twice. He's not going to get tagged a 3rd time. I would go him. I know they just splashed on Draymond Jones, but you saw when Leonard Williams came over, it kind of helped them. They moved Draymond almost to exclusively a 5-tech end and did different things. And I agree with you. Williams was a great Seattle Seahawk. He was not why the defense could not get back on track to close out the year. At the same time, though, I know Wagner just made an All-Pro and a Pro Bowl, whatever. He's not quite the same Bobby Wagner we're used to. Jordan Brooks is the guy who is going to be covering players, as your off-ball guy. I think an underrated player. I like both. They're both in my top 50 free agents. I actually thought maybe you were going to mention Damian Lewis, too, who I think is a pretty good football player in his own right. But I'll go with Leonard Williams just because, I think it's easier to find what Jordan Brooks brings to the table in free agency than it is to go get another Leonard Williams. Maybe I'm also, though, buying into the sunk cost fallacy a little bit.
Yeah, that may be part of it, but I would tend to agree with you, and it's not a knock on Jordan Brooks. I think there's a chance Seattle gets both these guys back. But if you have to pick one or the other, Seattle's had a really hard time with defensive tackles. Leonard Williams, he's only going to be 30 years old. He's played a lot of football, but still, DTs can age really well. So got to wonder what the pick would be if they had to choose between those two. But I do think there's a chance that they get both those guys back. And Damian Lewis, I think with the interior line, that's probably one of their top priorities as well. Let's talk Devon Witherspoon now. You threw out the name, and I think this is a good way to tie this entire show together because you mentioned these rookie contracts and how that ends up adding so much value. And that's something that's going to attract any coaching candidate when you have a guy like Devon Witherspoon. But PFF named him the defensive rookie of the year and also had him on the all-pro team for PFF. So what went behind that? Because we saw the all-pro teams today and he only got a couple votes from the AP, but what went into him getting that selection? And would you consider him the favorite to win defensive rookie of the year?
I think the interesting thing with him was, early on, you talk about he was getting cross-trained, playing in the slot and playing out wide. I know he even said he kind of likes playing in the slot, and because he can be physical, he can, like we said, nickel blitz and make a ton of splash plays in the backfield or just near the line of scrimmage. But the fact that he was able to do both, where there are games where he's playing 50-plus snaps out wide, and also then games where he's playing 50-plus snaps in the slot, he's still as sticky as ever in coverage. He's already one of the better run-defending cornerbacks in the entire NFL, in an age where a lot of these young bucks don't really want to tackle, come up, run the alley, get in the muck, and make plays. Like, that's all he wants to do, right? So, really, really good. Transitioned very, very well. I think there were times in the middle part of the year we got picked on a little bit in terms of like stop and goes and double moves and things like that. But you saw, for me at least, like, he didn't make the same mistake twice a lot. And I think he just learned and adapted on the fly so much in every responsibility. But I guess the biggest thing we loved about him is just the versatility. I mean, it's just like, for example, I love Joey Porter Jr. I think he had a great year this year. Pittsburgh asked him to do one thing. He did that one thing very, very well, but it was like, you're gonna cover number one receivers. You're gonna play up and press like 80% of the time, and you're gonna just like cover number ones, follow them around, and just play head up coverage. He was great at it, but it's like Devon has a million different responsibilities. So anyway, do I think he could win actual? Maybe. I feel like Jalen Carter. I know the odds have been changing. Jalen Carter and Will Anderson are also going to get very, very strong consideration. He should be in the top 3 though, comfortably. But yeah, I don't know which way to go there. But he was great.
I think when you look at the stats historically, and this is not me being a homer because I host a Seahawks podcast, but he's the only rookie since 1999 with 16 pass breakups, 3 sacks, and 8 tackles for loss. And only 7 players have done that since 1999. Like, that to me screams rookie of the year. And I know Jalen Carter had a great season. I know Will Anderson did, but this is going to be a really fun rookie of the year race, just like it was last year when Reek Woolen had his helmet in the ring for that one. But Pete Carroll out as head coach, but the last draft pick that he was championing for, it looks like he's going to be an absolute superstar in the NFL. So he and John Schneider seem to hit that one out of the park. Brad, we greatly appreciate having you here on the podcast. For our listeners, you can follow him on X. I'm still getting used to saying that, on X at PFF_. Brad, you can follow me at Corbin Smith NFL. Make sure to subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks wherever you get your podcast, and make sure you don't miss a single episode. We'll have another episode coming later today, and we're going to be playing The Bachelor Seahawks Coaching Edition. It should be a lot of fun. Make sure you're listening in. Go Hawks.